Most people who call themselves empaths are describing sensitivity. They feel things deeply, absorb other people's emotions, struggle with boundaries. And that's real. But Carl Jung identified something far beyond ordinary empathic sensitivity, a type so rare that he barely encountered it outside of the most psychologically developed individuals he ever studied. He connected it to the archetype of Sophia, the ancient symbol of divine wisdom. And what he found was that certain people don't just feel the world around them. They understand it at a depth that borders on the uncanny. Not because they've studied more or tried harder, but because something in the architecture of their psyche operates on a fundamentally different level than almost everyone else. Jung spent years mapping the stages of psychological development, and Sophia sat at the very top. She wasn't an emotion, she wasn't a feeling. She was a way of perceiving reality that integrated everything, light and dark, conscious and unconscious, personal and collective, into a single, coherent knowing. And the people who carried this archetype as their dominant mode of being didn't just experience empathy. They experienced a form of wisdom so instinctive, so immediate, and so penetrating that it often frightened the people around them, including themselves. Today, I'm going to show you the 7 specific signs that you carry this Sophia archetype according to Jung's framework, why this isn't just another personality label, but a profound psychological reality, and what it actually means to live as someone whose empathy operates through wisdom rather than absorption. Because if you've always felt that your sensitivity was different from what other empaths describe, quieter, deeper, more like knowing than feeling, you may be recognizing something about yourself that finally has a name. Jung observed that people operating from the Sophia level didn't process reality the way others did. Where most people needed evidence, argument, and proof to arrive at understanding, Sophia types arrived at understanding first and found the evidence later. Where most people experienced emotions as reactions to events, Sophia types experienced emotions as information, data about the deeper structure of what was actually happening beneath the surface. This wasn't intuition in the casual sense. This was a fully developed perceptual system that integrated conscious awareness with unconscious knowledge in real time. And here's what made this so rare. Most people never reach the Sophia stage of development, not because they're incapable, but because reaching it requires a degree of shadow integration, psychological honesty, and willingness to sit with paradox that most people actively avoid. You can't access Sophia-level perception while still running from your own darkness. You can't see the world with that kind of clarity while maintaining comfortable illusions about yourself. The price of this wisdom is everything false about you, and most people aren't willing to pay it. But some people seem to arrive at this level almost naturally, not because they bypassed the work, but because life forced the work upon them. Their circumstances demanded psychological development so early and so intensely that they integrated shadow material, developed pattern recognition, and cultivated inner knowing before they had language for any of it. These are the Sophia empaths. And if you are one, the following 7 signs won't just resonate with you. They'll feel like someone is finally describing the experience you've been living your entire life without anyone acknowledging it. The first sign is that you experience knowing before understanding. This is the hallmark of Sophia-level perception, and it's disorienting precisely because it reverses the normal order of cognition. Most people observe something, analyze it, process it, and then arrive at a conclusion. You arrive at the conclusion first. The knowing lands in your body, in your awareness, fully formed, and then you spend hours, days, sometimes weeks finding the rational framework to explain what you already know. You meet someone, and you know something essential about them immediately. Not a vague feeling, not a hunch that might be projection, actual knowledge about who they are beneath the surface. You know the marriage is failing before anyone has said a word about it. You know the business deal will collapse before any red flags appear. You know someone is lying not because you caught an inconsistency, but because the truth of the situation is already present in your awareness, like a fact you simply haven't been told yet. This creates a specific kind of frustration that Sophia empaths carry constantly. You know things you can't prove. You see outcomes you can't justify with available evidence. You recognize dynamics that won't become visible to others for months or years. And in a world that demands proof, logic, and rational explanation for every claim, your way of knowing feels illegitimate. You've learned to second-guess yourself not because your knowing is unreliable, but because no one around you can validate how you arrived at it. Jung recognized this pattern in his most psychologically developed patients. He noted that they had access to what he called the collective unconscious in a way that was more immediate and more usable than the average person. They weren't channeling mystical information. They were processing vast amounts of data, emotional, energetic, psychological, relational, at speeds and depths their conscious mind couldn't track. The knowing felt sudden, but it wasn't. It was the result of a perceptual system so sophisticated that its processing happened entirely beneath conscious awareness. You don't see the work your psyche is doing, you only see the result. And the result looks like you just know things you shouldn't be able to know. The second sign is that your solitude isn't avoidance, it's necessity. Most empaths describe needing alone time because social interaction drains them. They absorb too much, feel too much, and need to recover. That's real, but it's not what's happening with you. Your solitude serves a completely different function. You don't retreat to recover from overwhelm. You retreat because the depth of processing your psyche performs requires uninterrupted space. You're not hiding from the world, you're integrating it. When you're alone, something activates in your consciousness that can't operate when others are present. Patterns that were registering beneath your awareness start to surface and connect. Insights that had been forming in the background of your psyche become clear. The knowing that you've been carrying without understanding begins to organize itself into coherent meaning. Your solitude is where your deepest cognitive and psychological work happens. And it's not optional. Without it, you feel not just tired but cognitively impaired, like you're trying to think through static. Jung would have called this the process of active imagination unfolding naturally. In most people, this kind of deep inner work requires deliberate practice, meditation, journaling, dream analysis. But Sophia Empaths do it automatically. Their psyche is constantly processing, integrating, and synthesizing at a level that requires periods of withdrawal from external stimulation. And the people around them almost never understand this. They see someone who cancels plans, who disappears for days, who chooses silence over company, and they interpret it as depression or antisocial behavior. But you know the difference. Depression feels heavy and purposeless. Your solitude feels active, alive, necessary. Something is happening inside you during those quiet hours, even when you can't name it. You emerge from periods of withdrawal with clarity you didn't have before, with understanding that wasn't available to you in the noise of social interaction. You've learned to protect this process even when it costs you relationships, because you've discovered that without it, you lose access to the very perception that defines how you experience reality. The third sign is that people seek you out in their darkest moments, not for comfort, but for truth. There's a difference between being someone people turn to when they want to feel better and being someone people turn to when they need to understand what's actually happening. Sophia Empaths are the second kind, and it's not a role you chose. It's a role that found you, often before you were old enough to carry it. People sense your capacity for seeing clearly, even when they can't articulate what they're sensing. They come to you not for reassurance, but for the thing almost no one else will give them, an honest account of what's really going on. The friend who finally admits her relationship is abusive doesn't come to you for sympathy. She comes because she knows you'll tell her what she already suspects but needs to hear from someone who won't sugarcoat it. The colleague drowning in a toxic work environment doesn't want you to validate his complaints. He wants you to help him see the pattern he's caught in so he can decide whether to leave. This puts you in a position that's both honored and exhausting. People trust you with their rawest truths precisely because they sense your wisdom won't flinch at darkness. But they don't always realize what it costs you to hold that space. You're not just listening to their problems, you're perceiving the entire psychological architecture generating those problems, the childhood wounds, the defense mechanisms, the unconscious patterns driving the cycle they can't break. You see it all at once, and you have to decide in real time how much truth this person can actually absorb without being destroyed by it. Sophia types functioned as what he called natural analysts. They possessed therapeutic capacity without formal training because their perception automatically organized psychological material into coherent patterns. People didn't just feel heard by them, they felt seen in a way that was almost unbearable. And this is why the relationship between a Sophia empath and the people who seek them out is often complicated. The person seeking truth wants clarity, but when clarity actually arrives, it demands change. And not everyone who asks for the truth is ready to act on it. You've learned this lesson painfully. You've given honest perception to people who asked for it and watched them reject it, resent you for it, or punish you for seeing what they weren't ready to face. And over time, you've developed a discernment about when to speak and when to remain silent that most people would never understand. You hold so much of what you see, not because you're afraid, but because you've learned that wisdom isn't just about seeing clearly. It's about knowing when truth will heal and when it will only wound. The fourth sign is that you see cycles where everyone else sees isolated events. When something happens, a conflict, a crisis, a collapse, most people treat it as a singular occurrence. They react to the surface event, process the immediate emotions, and move on. But you don't experience events as isolated. You experience them as expressions of deeper patterns that have been repeating, sometimes for generations. You see the architecture behind the event, the historical roots, the psychological inheritance, the way this moment connects to 100 moments that came before it and predicts 100 that will come after. This is what makes your perception so different from ordinary empathic sensitivity. You're not just feeling the pain of the present moment, you're perceiving the entire cycle that produced it. When your friend's relationship ends, you don't just see two people breaking up. You see the attachment wound from her childhood that made her choose someone unavailable, the pattern her mother modeled before her, and the specific way this cycle will repeat unless something fundamental shifts in how she relates to her own worth. You see all of it simultaneously, and you've seen it unfolding since the beginning, long before anyone else noticed. Jung would have connected this to what he explored as the archetypal layer of experience. He believed certain patterns existed not just in individual psyches, but in the collective unconscious. Templates of human experience that repeat across cultures, families, and generations. Sophia empaths perceive these templates naturally. They see the myth inside the mundane. They recognize the ancient pattern inside the modern problem. They understand that what looks like a personal crisis is often the expression of something much older and much larger than the individual experiencing it. This perception is simultaneously a gift and a burden that's hard to communicate to anyone who doesn't share it. You watch people make the same choices their parents made, enter the same dynamics their grandparents modeled, repeat cycles they swear they'll never repeat, and you see it coming not because you're pessimistic, but because the pattern is visible to you in a way that's as clear as watching someone walk toward the edge of a cliff. The hardest part isn't seeing the cycle. The hardest part is knowing that most people can only recognize a cycle after they've completed it, and your seeing it in advance rarely gives you the power to interrupt it for them. And if this depth of perception is something you carry every day, this constant awareness of patterns most people can't see, then you understand how rare and how isolating this kind of knowing truly is. And that's exactly the kind of inner territory that true self-discovery was designed to help you navigate. 24 reflection exercises grounded in Carl Jung's teachings, built for people whose inner world operates at depths that need space and structure to be explored. If you've been carrying wisdom that has no outlet, this guide gives it a place to land. Click below to get true self-discovery. The fifth sign is that you carry a grief that isn't personal. This is one of the most misunderstood experiences of the Sophia empath, and it's often what leads them to believe something is psychologically wrong with them. You carry a sadness that doesn't attach to any specific loss, any particular event, any identifiable wound. It's deeper than that. It's a grief for the human condition itself, for the suffering you perceive everywhere, for the patterns you watch repeat, for the distance between what people could be and what they settle for the beauty of existence and the simultaneous tragedy of how unconsciously most people move through it. This isn't depression, though it can be misdiagnosed as such. Depression feels flat, empty, purposeless. This grief feels full. It feels almost sacred. It carries weight, but also depth. It's the grief of someone who sees too clearly and loves too completely to be unaffected by what they see. You feel the collective pain of the world, not because you're absorbing it the way ordinary empaths absorb emotions, but because your perception is wide enough and deep enough to register suffering at a scale most people are mercifully blind to. Jung himself described something similar when he talked about the suffering that comes with consciousness. He recognized that awareness is not a neutral state. The more clearly you see, the more pain you register. Not because reality is only painful, but because consciousness includes awareness of everything: the beauty and the destruction, the love and the cruelty, the potential and the waste. People with ordinary levels of awareness are protected from much of this by their psychological defenses. They filter reality down to a manageable scope, but Sophia Empaths can't filter that way. Their perception is too wide, and so they carry a grief that has no specific object because its object is everything. You've probably been told you're too serious, too deep, that you need to lighten up, that you think too much, and you've learned to perform lightness when necessary because the alternative, expressing the actual depth of what you perceive and feel, tends to frighten people. But alone, in the quiet, you sit with this grief like an old companion. You don't try to fix it anymore. You've learned that it's not a problem to solve. It's a consequence of seeing clearly. And there's a strange peace in accepting that this sadness isn't a sign of brokenness. It's a sign that your perception is functioning exactly as it was designed to. The sixth sign is that you've outgrown every teacher, system, and framework you've ever encountered. At some point in your life, you were hungry for understanding. You devoured books, teachings, spiritual systems, psychological frameworks. Each one gave you language for part of your experience. Each one illuminated something, but none of them contained the whole picture. And eventually, you noticed that every system you studied had a boundary, a place where its explanations stopped and your knowing continued beyond it. This isn't arrogance, though it can feel that way from the outside. You didn't outgrow these systems because you think you're smarter than the people who created them. You outgrew them because Sophia-level perception doesn't fit inside any single framework. It's too integrative. It sees connections between systems that the systems themselves don't acknowledge. It perceives truths that exist in the spaces between traditions, in the territory no single map has charted. You took what each teacher offered, absorbed what was true, and then found yourself standing in a landscape of understanding that no one had described to you, because it existed beyond what any individual teaching could contain. Jung would have understood this deeply. His own intellectual journey followed a similar arc. He studied with Freud, absorbed everything valuable, then moved beyond into territory Freud's framework couldn't reach. He studied Eastern religions, alchemy, mythology, quantum physics. He drew from every available source because he recognized that truth was too large for any single container. And the people who carry the Sophia archetype experience this same quality. They're perpetual synthesizers. They don't belong to any one school of thought because their perception naturally integrates across all of them. This creates a specific kind of intellectual and spiritual homelessness that Sophia Empaths know intimately. You don't fully belong in any community because you see the limitations of every community's framework. You can appreciate what each tradition offers while simultaneously perceiving what it misses. And this means you often walk alone philosophically, spiritually, psychologically. Not because you reject what others believe, but because your knowing extends into territory that hasn't been mapped by any tradition you've encountered. The loneliness of this is real, but so is the freedom, because you're not confined by any framework's blind spots. You see from a vantage point that belongs entirely to you. The seventh sign, and this is the one that often catches Sophia Empaths off guard, is that your presence changes rooms without you doing anything at all. You walk into a space and the energy shifts. Not because you're projecting confidence or charisma or performing any social function. Something about your field, your frequency, the depth of awareness you carry, it registers in other people's nervous systems whether you want it to or not. Sometimes this shift is positive. People calm down around you. Conversations deepen. defenses lower. Something about your presence creates a container where people feel safe enough to be honest, where the pretense that dominates most social interactions softens and something more real emerges. You've noticed this. The way people confess things to you they've never told anyone else. The way strangers open up. The way groups become more authentic when you're present. But sometimes this shift is destabilizing. People who are invested in their masks, their performances, their carefully constructed personas, they feel threatened by your presence even when you haven't said a word. They sense that your perception penetrates surface reality, and that awareness alone makes them uncomfortable. You've experienced people becoming hostile toward you for no apparent reason, avoiding you, talking about you behind your back. And you've never understood why, because you weren't doing anything. You were just being present. But your presence itself carries a quality of truth that unconscious people experience as a threat to their defenses. Jung documented this phenomenon in people with highly developed psychological awareness. He found that consciousness itself has an effect on the field around it. A person who has integrated significant shadow material, who perceives clearly, who operates from genuine self-knowledge, that person radiates a quality that others register unconsciously. Some are drawn to it like moths to light, others flee from it as if it were fire. And the Sophia Empath experiences both reactions constantly, often simultaneously, without ever intending to create either response. This is perhaps the most isolating aspect of being this type. Your very presence creates reactions you didn't choose and can't control. People respond to what you are, not what you do. And what you are, someone who sees clearly, knows deeply, and carries wisdom that most people spend entire lifetimes never accessing, is inherently confronting to a world that runs on comfortable illusions. You've probably learned to dim yourself in social situations, to pull your awareness back, to perform a shallower version of yourself so that the people around you aren't overwhelmed by the full weight of who you actually are. And that dimming has a cost that almost no one around you can see. Now, if you recognize yourself in these 7 signs, not casually, not as interesting ideas, but as the lived texture of your daily experience, then you need to understand what Jung believed about people like you. Because having Sophia-level perception isn't a spiritual achievement to celebrate, it's a psychological reality to navigate. And navigating it poorly destroys people who carry this capacity just as surely as never recognizing it does. The primary danger for Sophia Empaths was what he called the burden of unused wisdom. When you perceive at this depth but have no structure for integrating what you perceive, no practice for processing the volume of information your psyche handles, no relationships where your full perception is received, the wisdom turns inward and becomes a weight that crushes rather than illuminates. You start carrying truth you can't express, seeing patterns you can't share, knowing things you can't act on. And that unexpressed knowing doesn't just sit quietly. It creates anxiety, insomnia, physical tension, a restlessness that never fully resolves because its source isn't emotional, it's perceptual. You're taking in more reality than you have an outlet for. The second danger is what Jung would have called inflation. When you realize that your perception genuinely operates at a level most people can't access, there's a temptation to identify with that capacity, to build your sense of self around being the wise one, the one who sees, the one who knows. And the moment that happens, you've lost the very quality that makes Sophia perception genuine. Because real wisdom includes awareness of your own blindness. Real knowing includes humility about what you don't know. The instant your perception becomes an identity rather than a function, it distorts. You start seeing what confirms your self-image rather than what's actually true. And a Sophia Empath operating from inflation is more dangerous than an unconscious person, because their perception is sophisticated enough to construct elaborate justifications for their ego's needs. Jung warned about this consistently. He saw brilliant, perceptive people become trapped in their own insight, using their capacity for deep seeing as a defense against being seen themselves. They'd analyze everyone else while remaining blind to their own patterns. They'd perceive the world with extraordinary clarity while maintaining comfortable delusions about their own psychology. And the tragedy was that their perception was real. They really could see what others couldn't. but they used that genuine ability to avoid the one thing their wisdom demanded most, turning that penetrating gaze on themselves with the same unflinching honesty they applied to everyone else. The third danger is isolation that becomes permanent. Every sign I've described carries an element of separation from ordinary experience, the knowing that can't be validated, the solitude that's misunderstood, the grief that can't be shared, the outgrowing of every framework, the presence that creates reactions you can't control. Each of these, taken individually, is manageable. Taken together, they create a cumulative isolation that can become so total, so entrenched, that the Sophia Empath gives up on connection entirely. Jung believed this was the greatest waste of the Sophia capacity, because this perception, this wisdom, isn't meant to exist in isolation. It's meant to function in relationship, with other people, with the world, with life itself. The Sophia archetype in Jung's framework represented the integration of wisdom and love. Not wisdom as detachment, but wisdom as the deepest form of engagement. When a Sophia empath withdraws completely, they're protecting themselves, but they're also betraying the nature of their own gift. Because wisdom that never touches another person, that never enters relationship, that never risks being seen, that's not wisdom. It's knowledge locked in a vault, and it corrodes. The path forward, according to Jung's framework, isn't about finding a community that understands you, though that helps. It's about accepting the fundamental paradox of your existence. You see more than most people. That will always be true. You carry knowledge that creates distance. That won't change. But the wisdom you possess is only fully activated when it meets the world, when it enters conversation, relationship, creative expression, meaningful work, when it stops being something you carry alone and becomes something you offer, carefully, selectively, but genuinely, to the people and situations that can receive it. This means learning to tolerate being partially understood. No one will ever see the full depth of what you perceive. But partial understanding, genuine connection that reaches 3 or 4 layers deep, even if it can't reach all 7, that's enough. That's where Sophia stops being a burden and starts being what Jung intended it to represent: living wisdom, embodied knowing, perception that illuminates not just your own consciousness, but the consciousness of everyone it touches. The Sophia archetype is not a personality type in the modern sense. It's not a label to add to your identity. It's a level of psychological development that carries specific responsibilities. The responsibility to keep integrating your own shadow, even when you'd rather focus on what you see in others. The responsibility to stay in relationship with the world, even when withdrawal feels safer. The responsibility to use your perception in service of something larger than your own comfort or your own need to be recognized as wise. And here's what Jung understood that most people discussing archetypes miss entirely. Sophia isn't a destination. It's a mode of being that deepens endlessly. There's no point at which you finish developing this capacity. Every year of honest psychological work, every shadow confronted, every comfortable illusion surrendered, each one expands what your perception can reach. The wisdom gets deeper, the knowing gets more precise, the grief becomes more integrated with joy. The isolation becomes more consciously chosen rather than unconsciously imposed. You don't arrive at Sophia and stop. You arrive and discover that the real work is only beginning. If you've recognized yourself in these 7 signs, you're holding something most people never develop and wouldn't know how to carry if they did. Your knowing before understanding, your necessary solitude, your capacity to hold truth for others, your perception of cycles, your sacred grief, your transcendence of frameworks, your presence that shifts rooms. These aren't symptoms to fix. They're capacities to honor, develop, and use with the care they demand. You are rare. Not in the way the internet uses that word, as flattery designed to make you feel special. Rare in the way Jung meant it, as a psychological reality that carries weight, consequence, and responsibility. What you do with this perception will determine whether it becomes the most valuable thing about you or the thing that slowly destroys you. And that choice isn't made once. It's made every day, in every interaction, every time you decide whether to see clearly or look away, whether to stay engaged or withdraw, whether to offer your wisdom or lock it inside where it's safe but useless. Jung dedicated his life to understanding people like you, not because you were curiosities, but because he believed that people capable of Sophia-level perception were essential to the psychological health of the collective. You see what needs to be seen. You know what needs to be known. You carry awareness that the world desperately needs, even when the world doesn't know how to receive it. And your task, the real task, beneath all the signs and descriptions, is to find the courage to remain engaged with a world that can't fully comprehend what you bring to it. That's not a burden. That's the deepest expression of the wisdom you carry. Sophia, after all, doesn't mean knowing. It means the love of knowing. And love, by definition, reaches towards something beyond itself. If you haven't yet, there's a guide called True Self-Discovery, built around 24 reflection exercises rooted in Carl Jung's teachings, designed to help you turn this kind of deep inner knowing into something structured, something you can work with instead of just carry. If the wisdom you hold has been searching for a framework that doesn't shrink it, this is where it begins. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.